Summary and Analysis Chapter 35 of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Summary. Tom is dissatisfied that liberating Jim will be so easy. He wishes there were guards to drug, or a guard dog, or that Jim were better chained down. He sighs that he and Huck will have to invent difficulties, for he wants the escape to be as grand as one of those carried out in the romantic books he likes to read. Tom also proposes that he and Huck make Jim a rope ladder by tearing and tying up their sheets, and that they then bake it into a pie so it can be delivered to Jim. Huck thinks this plan is unnecessary, but Tom disagrees. Huck gives in, but cautions Tom that Aunt Sally will be greatly displeased to find that the boys have torn up her sheets. Huck suggests that he and Tom steal a sheet off of the clotheslines, and Tom agrees. Tom also says that Huck should steal a shirt off the clothesline, so that Jim can use it to keep a journal. Huck exclaims that Jim doesn't even know how to write, to which Tom responds that Jim can at least make marks on the shirt. He also proposes Jim be given something like a candlestick to file into a pen, that he use his own blood as ink, and that he be smuggled tin plates to write little messages on before throwing them out of the window to be read. Huck thinks all this is impractical. That morning, Huck steals things to give Jim, as well as a watermelon from the slave's watermelon patch. Tom, however, tells Huck that he can only steal what he needs to help set Jim free, and he demands that Huck give the slaves a dime without telling them that it is in exchange for the stolen watermelon. Huck doesn't see what good it does him to represent a prisoner if it means he can't even steal a watermelon. Finally, Tom tells Huck that they need to steal tools to dig Jim out of the hut with. Huck asks why they don't use some picks and shovels the two found earlier, but Tom says that no prisoner has ever used picks or shovels, and that what they need for digging are knives. Tom calculates it would take 37 years to dig to Jim with knives, and, knowing that he and Huck can't take that long, he proposes that he and Huck pretend amongst themselves that it takes them 37 years to save Jim. Huck says that pretending isn't impractical and doesn't hurt anyone, so he agrees. Tom tells Huck to steal 3 knives and, after a little protest, Huck agrees to do so.
Analysis. Exhibiting a subtle racism, Tom regards Jim less as a human being who needs aid and more as a prop in his adventure, one he imaginatively and fondly drapes in yet more chains. He has inherited societal racism, and also dangerous romantic conventions from his books. It is a sign of Huck's vestigial immaturity that he listens to Tom instead of his own heart. To his credit, he tries to reason with Tom, but we think that Huck would do better to just act independently and rescue Jim as soon as he can, without Tom's childish insistence on making a game out of a human being's freedom. Tom's plan is as big a farce as anything the Duke and King perpetrated, and it devalues human life to a similar if subtler extent. Tom has inherited a new set of conventions from his books and madly sets about satisfying them, even if absurdly so. Example, he gives Jim things to write with even though Jim can't write. Huck's lack of resistance here calls into question the permanence of his earlier moral development. Ironically, nothing Tom and Huck steal is needed to help set Jim free. Tom's insistence to the contrary suggests that he is not living in the real world. It is also disturbingly uncharacteristic that Huck would steal the watermelon without needing it, something he hasn't done since he was in Pap's care. Huck and Tom finally seem to come to their senses and grow up a little in this scene. Tom realizes and accepts that his plan is impractical, so he resigns himself to pretending, which, as Huck rightly points out, is harmless enough. He and Tom can save Jim in a timely fashion, and Tom can have his adventure too. That being said, Tom is still insistent that Huck fetch some knives to dig with, bad tools for the job, impractical, fantastical, and farcical.
Summary and Analysis Chapter 36 of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Summary. In the night, Huck and Tom begin digging with their knives to rescue Jim, but after a while are tired, blistered, and realize they haven't gotten hardly anywhere. The boys switch to digging with picks instead, but agree to pretend that those are knives. The next day, Huck and Tom steal a spoon and candlestick from the house for Jim to use as pens, as well as some plates for Jim to write messages on. Later, at night, the boys dig into the hut where Jim is imprisoned and wake him, much to Jim's pleasant surprise. Jim asks the boys to help him cut the chain off his leg that he might escape immediately, but Tom explains to Jim his romantically stylish, time-consuming plan, which Jim accepts. Jim tells the boys that Uncle Silas comes into the hut once in a while to pray with him, and that Aunt Sally does likewise to make sure he's comfortable. This gives Tom an idea. He wants to trick Nat, the slave who brings Jim food, into bringing Jim a rope ladder that's been baked into a pie. The boys talk with Jim for a while before leaving him. Tom says he is having the most fun of his life, and that he and Huck should keep their game up so for as long as possible, and even suggests that they leave Jim's rescue up to their own children. One night, dogs get into Jim's hut. When Nat sees the dogs, he almost faints, thinking that witches are responsible. Tom tells Nat that, to appease the witches, he should make a witch pie. Nat says he doesn't know how, so Tom volunteers to bake the pie for him, as long as Nat promises not to look at or handle what Tom gives him. Nat promises.
Analysis. It is to Tom's credit that, when he realizes how absurdly impractical a given plan is, he switches to a more practical plan while pretending otherwise. Though Tom is willing to pretend regarding some aspects of his plan, other aspects, like the message writing, he is childishly stubborn about. Jim makes it clear that he understandably wants to be rescued as soon as possible, but with an unimaginative and racist disregard, Tom persuades Jim to go along with his ridiculous plan. Uncle Silas and Aunt Sally clearly recognize that Jim has human needs, and yet remain oblivious to the fact that they are hypocritically violating those needs in keeping Jim in the first place. Tom is likewise a hypocrite. He knows Jim needs to be freed, but selfishly wishes he could draw out the rescue attempt for childish pleasure. Huck doesn't buy into any of this, save insofar as he passively accepts it. Tom exploits Nat's superstitions in playing out his romantic game of rescuing Jim. We wonder what's worse, Huck stealing from the slave's watermelon patch, or Tom playing on a person's fears, to which there is a racial component, for the sake of personal pleasure.
Summary and Analysis Chapter 37 of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Summary. Tom and Huck get what they need to bake the witch pie. Afterwards, the boys go down to breakfast, hiding a spoon for Jim to write with in Uncle Silas's pocket, and nails in his hat, only to find Aunt Sally livid that things in the house are going missing. Uncle Silas suggests ways things could go missing, like rats getting them, but Aunt Sally dismisses them all. She is irritated and suspicious. Uncle Silas goes on to sheepishly produce the spoon hidden in his pocket by Huck and Tom. Aunt Sally hotly dismisses everyone from the kitchen, so she can calm down. Uncle Silas finds the nail in his hat, but doesn't mention it. Tom recognizes that Uncle Silas has helped him and Huck conceal their plan to help Jim by producing the spoon at breakfast, and so he resolves to help Uncle Silas by plugging holes in the cellar through which rats enter and exit the house. Later, Uncle Silas comes downstairs and sees that all of the holes have been plugged. He can't remember having done that chore for the life of him. Huck and Tom steal another spoon, but pretend that Aunt Sally miscounted how many there were to cover their tracks. Tom tells Aunt Sally that, even with the spoon Uncle Silas found, the spoon set is incomplete. Aunt Sally recounts, but Huck and Tom keep tricking her into thinking she has miscounted. Aunt Sally becomes mad and storms off. Huck and Tom hide the spoon they stole in her apron along with a nail, both of which she inadvertently delivers to Jim in his hut. After a lot of trouble and experimentation, Tom and Huck bake the witch pie, which is basically a crust under which is hidden a ladder. Nat delivers the pie to Jim, which Jim busts open so that he can take the ladder out and hide it in his mattress. He also scratches some marks on a tin and throws it out of his window, in accordance with Tom's plan.
Analysis. Tom's plan is time-consuming to execute, but it's also problematic in raising so many suspicions. Aunt Sally is at wit's end and, far from accepting Uncle Silas's charmingly naive explanations as to how things went missing, she seems to suspect that the children in the household are involved. But, even though Aunt Sally is on high alert for funny business, Tom does not change his plan. Tom goes out of his way to compensate Uncle Silas for helping him and Huck cover up their plans, even though he did so unintentionally. While this is not really mature of Tom, it reflects that his heart, at least, is in the right place. He may live in a fantasy world, but he does have a sense of what it means to be good. Huck and Tom's pranks seem harmless enough, and also serve to prevent the Phelpses from discovering the boys' plan to help Jim, but it must be remembered that, while Huck and Jim play their ridiculous games, Jim is enchained in a hut, separated from his family. We might wonder why Jim goes along with Tom's ridiculous plan at all. It could be that he trusts Tom, thinking him bright and genuinely interested in helping out. But Jim doesn't respect his own judgment, maybe because he has been trained by whites to respect theirs over his own.
Summary and Analysis Chapter 38 of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Summary. Tom insists that Jim make an inscription with his coat of arms on the wall of his hut, because all the prisoners in romances do. Jim says he doesn't have a coat of arms, so Tom designs him one, which he describes using technical jargon that he doesn't even really understand. Tom also writes inscriptions for Jim's wall, all of which make him cry, so that he decides to have Jim carve them all into the wall. Tom changes his mind. Jim can't carve inscriptions onto the wooden walls of his hut, he must carve them into stone. Tom proposes, then, that he and Huck steal a grindstone to carve the inscriptions into, and which can also be used to file the pens and saw. Huck and Tom set out to the mill to get the grindstone, and roll it back to the hut. When they have the grindstone halfway home, Tom and Huck realize that they can't roll it all the way without help, because it is too heavy, so they go back to Jim's hut. There, they make it so that Jim can walk freely even though he still has a chain around his ankle, and he goes out and helps Huck roll the grindstone the rest of the way home. Tom superintends with great skill. Huck notes, he knowed how to do everything. Having gotten the grindstone home and rechained Jim to his bed, the boys are ready to go to sleep. But before leaving, Tom asks Jim if he could bring some spiders, rats, and snakes into Jim's hut, so that Jim can befriend them as the prisoners do in the books. Jim begs Tom not to, but Tom insists. Jim faults Tom's plan, to which Tom responds by saying that Jim is wasting his opportunity to be the best, most famous prisoner of all time. Jim apologizes to Tom, and the boys shove off for bed.
Analysis. Tom doesn't understand much of what he reads, yet he blindly acts on his reading anyway, just as society blindly acts on untested, internally inconsistent beliefs. He may be better educated than Huck, but Huck is imaginatively freer than Tom. His immaturity lies in doing what his friend says. Tom is again a slave to the romantic convention he loves here, insisting on fetching the impractical grindstone. Huck says nothing. Does he love Tom too much to contradict him, or does he feel he just can't out-argue Tom? Jim achieves freedom in this scene for all intents and purposes, and yet, for whatever reason, he is bound to Tom's plan so tightly that he helps the boys realize their ridiculous fantasy instead of making a break for it. Meanwhile, Tom oversees Huck and Jim as they work. Like a little king, or, more shockingly, like a slave owner himself. The boys disturbingly rechain Jim to his bed, which, we think, people committed to his freedom would not do if they were in their right minds. But Tom doesn't seem to be in his right mind, exactly. He is happy to make Jim more uncomfortable than he already is, because he thinks that his plan will make Jim famous. His love of the conventions of romance is verging on obsessive.
Summary and Analysis Chapter 39 of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Summary. Jim is agitated by the creatures that Tom and Huck introduce to his hut. He says that there isn't hardly any room for him, and that the creatures are very lively when he tries to sleep. The spiders and rats bite him. He uses his blood afterward to write in his journal. He says he never wants to be a prisoner again, especially after the boys saw the legs of his bed and all three eat the sawdust together to hide the evidence, which gives them all terrible stomachaches. After all preparations are completed, Tom says that he and Huck need to write an anonymous letter to warn the Phelpses that someone is going to try to rescue Jim. Huck mildly protests, but soon gives in to Tom's plan. The boys leave notes and ominous warnings around the Phelps house that terrify the family. Tom also writes a note saying that a gang of cutthroats will try to steal Jim.
Analysis. Tom and Huck dehumanize Jim in this scene by ignoring his pleas and cramming his room with various, dangerous creatures. That said, they also endanger themselves by catching the creatures and eating sawdust, and the like, which suggests that their disregard of human safety is less a factor of racism, say, than general immaturity. Tom's plan of the anonymous letter is supremely immature and irresponsible. It terrorizes his family needlessly, and it jeopardizes the success of Jim's escape, which would be much better conducted in total secrecy. What is clear by now is that while Huck wants to free Jim, Tom is playing a game. For Tom, his games come before other people. For Huck, people always come first.
Summary and Analysis Chapter 40 of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Summary. The Phelps family is troubled and anxious after receiving the anonymous letter Tom wrote. Tom and Huck are sent to bed early, where they get ready to take a lunch they have prepared, along with a dress, to Jim. Tom notices there's no butter with the lunch, so he sends Huck to get some. As he's returning with the butter, though, Aunt Sally discovers Huck. She questions him and sends him to the sitting room for further questioning. In the sitting room, Huck is surprised to see 15 farmers, all with guns. Huck wishes Aunt Sally would get through with him so he can tell Tom about the farmers and commence rescuing Jim before it's too late. Aunt Sally questions Huck, but he's so nervous, because the farmers are talking about heading out then, and they're to lie in wait for the gang, that he becomes feverish. The farmers rush over to make sure Huck is all right, snatching off his hat as they do, out from under which comes the bread and butter he took. Aunt Sally is grateful Huck is okay, and sends him to bed. Huck hurries to meet Tom inside Jim's hut to tell him about the farmers. Tom is elated, but assures Huck that Jim is disguised as a woman and ready to make a run for it. Just then, the farmers come outside to the hut and open the door. Tom, Huck, and Jim escape through a hole they had made, and soon begin to make a run for the fence. However, Tom's pants catch a splinter. When he frees himself, a ripping noise alerts the gun-toting farmers who, after asking whoever's there to identify themselves without response, begin to rush over, shooting as they do. Chased by both men and dogs, the three run toward the river, and at last arrive at their raft. Everybody's glad to be safe and free, especially Tom, because he had the honor of being shot in the calf of his leg. He is in considerable pain and bleeding. After some deliberation, Jim says he will not leave Tom's side. Huck knew that Jim would say that, because he knows that Jim was white inside, and, while Jim tends to Tom, Huck goes off to fetch a doctor.
Analysis. Even though Tom has gotten his way in planning Jim's escape, he is tyrannical about even the smallest detail, like the butter, which he forces Huck to get despite Huck's protests. It is Tom's silly need to do everything prescribed by his books that best characterizes his immaturity. Many of the Phelps neighbors come to the family's aid in securing Jim, which is absurd given that Jim is a human being and not a piece of property to be guarded in the first place. This is a society, it would seem, that deeply honors the idea of private property. Its members are willing to die to protect another member's property. The irony, of course, is that Jim belongs to himself and no one else, yet he is denied that right of self-possession. Tom must be very much out of touch with reality to delight in the fact that there are many armed, dangerous men keeping an eye out for people escaping with Jim, given, of course, that he is just such a person. The armed farmers prove to be indiscriminately violent, shooting in the dark at they don't know what. They mindlessly run the risk of shooting Jim, which would defeat their purpose entirely. Tom idiotically revels in his wound, which he thinks is fun and exciting. It was his plan that endangered his friends and got him shot, and it's because he got shot that Jim feels duty-bound to risk his own freedom by staying with Tom. Huck's comment that Jim is white inside at once acknowledges Jim's equality, but also insidiously suggests that people who are black inside, so to speak, are bad. Huck is able to see past society's rules to see Jim's basic humanity, but he still accepts his society's larger social laws that to be human means to be white. This dichotomy strikes the reader as ridiculous. The reader can generalize from the fact of Jim's basic humanity to all slaves' basic humanity. Twain uses Huck's inability to do the same to actually underscore the point, and further condemn Southern society for its cruel, ridiculous blindness.
Summary and Analysis Chapter 41 of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Summary. Huck fetches a nice old doctor, telling him that Tom is his brother and that, while the two were out hunting, Tom had a bad dream and kicked his gun, which shot him. When the doctor asks Huck to tell him again how Tom was wounded, Huck says that he had a dream, and it shot him. The doctor replies, "Singular dream." The doctor paddles off in a canoe to the raft where Tom is, but the canoe can only carry one person, so Huck is forced to stay behind. He sleeps in a lumber pile that night, and by the time he wakes the sun is up. He decides to go to the where Tom and Jim are to prevent the doctor from exposing Jim to capture, but bumps into Uncle Silas as he sets out. Eventually, Uncle Silas takes Huck home, much to Aunt Sally's relief. At the Phelps house, neighbors are gathered, talking about how crazy it is that Jim made inscriptions in the grindstone, and the like, and they all reason that he must have had help from other slaves, who they also reason must have stolen things from the Phelps house. Soon, Aunt Sally wonders why Tom and Huck weren't in their room that morning. Huck gets up, thinks about it, and by way of explanation he lies to her. Aunt Sally grows increasingly worried that is Tom hasn't come home yet. Huck volunteers to fetch him, but Aunt Sally tells him he'll do no such thing. Uncle Silas goes out to look for Sid, but he doesn't even come across his path. After Aunt Sally tucks Huck into bed, she speaks with him and begins to cry. Huck feels so bad about making her worry that he promises her that he won't go off to look for Sid despite himself, and he keeps his word.
Analysis. The doctor assumes that Huck misspeaks when he says that it was Tom's dream that shot him, but in a sense this is exactly what happened. Tom's fealty to his romantic, impractical dream of Jim's escape led the farmers who shot Tom to be on the lookout in the first place. It is noble that Huck is always concerned with protecting Jim whenever he can, just as Jim protected him during their journey on the river. But Huck is not always free to act as he will. For example, he would go with the doctor, but the canoe can only carry one person. Huck's freedom is limited in part by external circumstances. The neighbors are right to think that a person who follows Tom's escape plan is crazy, or at least, in Tom's case, disastrously immature. Note, also, that the neighbors demonstrate their racism in thinking it must have been other slaves who helped Jim, not even considering that Huck and Tom could be responsible. When not in the company of Tom, Huck is restored to his good senses. He realizes how needlessly stressful Tom's plan has been for the Phelpses, and with noble self-discipline he declines to act on his own impulse to go to Tom for Aunt Sally's sake. Tom is a good friend, but not a good influence on Huck.
Summary and Analysis Chapter 42 of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Summary. The next morning, as Huck and the Phelpses sit around the breakfast table, Aunt Sally sees Tom on a mattress along with the doctor, Jim with his hands tied, and a bunch of people. Aunt Sally is profoundly relieved to find that Tom is alive. Men in the mob say they should hang Jim as a warning to other slaves, but others say his owner might come, and then they would have to pay for him, so they all refrain. The men in the mob also cuss at Jim and strike him, and put him back in the cabin and chained, but Tom's doctor tells them they shouldn't be rougher with Jim than they have to be, because Jim faithfully helped to treat Tom and risked his own freedom to do it. The men in the mob soften up on Jim and thank him for helping the doctor. Tom begins to recover, and comes fully to as Aunt Sally and Huck sit at his bedside. He joyfully recounts to an incredulous Aunt Sally how he and Huck helped Jim to escape. However, Tom's joy gives way to grave disappointment when he learns that Jim is back in bondage. He tells Aunt Sally that Jim is as free as any creature that walks this earth. He also reveals that he's known all along that Miss Watson had set Jim free 2 months ago in her will. As Tom is speaking, he notices that Aunt Polly, his guardian, has come in, much to Aunt Sally's delight. She reveals Tom and Huck's true identities, and tells the disgruntled Phelpses all about Huck. She also confirms that Miss Watson had set Jim free 2 months ago. Finally, during a conversation between the adults, it comes out that Tom was intercepting letters from Aunt Polly to Aunt Sally, which is why the latter didn't know that Tom was impersonating Sid.
Analysis. It is disgusting that men propose to hang Jim for fighting for his freedom, something they would do too were they in his shoes. It is also disgusting that the reason the men refrain from doing so is because they might have to pay for Jim, as though he were just a piece of property. The men's cruelty to Jim softens when the doctor humanizes him. But despite humanizing Jim, the doctor nevertheless made a point of bringing Jim back in chains, which seems hypocritical. How can he think of Jim as a human yet treat him like livestock? Tom's insistence that Jim is as free as any creature on earth seems to be the product of a change of heart, one maybe brought about by Jim's self-sacrifice for Tom. But then we learn that Tom is speaking in a legal sense. Not only has he delayed Jim's freedom with his plan, Tom has also treated Jim like a slave, even though he was legally free, all for the sake of self-indulgent adventure. It really was a game for Tom, with no stakes. Tom was freeing a man who was already free. At last, Tom and Huck's mess is sorted out by Aunt Polly's arrival. If Tom is an agent of deception and dangerous fancies, Aunt Polly is his opposite, an agent of truth and cold hard facts. It is good that Aunt Polly is back in Tom's life, we think, because he could benefit from a stern reality check.
Summary and Analysis Chapter 43 of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Summary. When Huck catches Tom in private, he asks Tom what his plan was if they had successfully escaped with Jim. Tom says he planned to have more adventures with Huck and Jim before revealing to Jim that he was free. After that, he would have compensated Jim for his lost time and reunited him with his family in style. Huck thinks it's just as well that things turned out as they did. Jim is unchained, and the Phelpses and Aunt Polly, upon learning how Jim helped Tom, take very good care of the newly freed man. Tom also gives Jim $40 for being such a patient prisoner, such that Jim can remind Huck that he predicted he would be rich, and now he is. Tom suggests that he and Huck and Jim travel to the territory for adventure, but Huck says he doesn't have enough money. Tom says that Huck still has $6,000 in Judge Thatcher's care, because Pap didn't take it and hasn't even been in town. Jim explains that Pap died, his was the corpse that Jim discovered in the floating house. Eventually, Tom heals completely. Huck is glad he doesn't have anything more to write about, because, he says, making a book was hard work. He says that he needs to head out to the territory soon. Aunt Sally is going to try to civilize him, which he can't stand, because, he says, I'd been there before.
Analysis. It is small comfort that Tom recognizes he was denying Jim precious time with his family as a free man, but that does not change the fact that Tom exploited Jim. Huck recognizes all of this, and that they are better off having cut the game short so that Jim can enjoy his true freedom with dignity. Jim's rewards for helping Tom seem paltry in comparison to the time he lost and the hardships he suffered. Jim, however, rejoices, maybe because it is in his character to make the best out of a bad situation, or maybe because Twain's representation of Jim here is in some ways racist and dehumanizing. There are many critics, by the way, who would argue that the novel is fantastic up until the appearance of Tom Sawyer, and who argue that Twain didn't really know how to end the novel and ended up reintroducing Tom and focusing more on the broad comedy of the escape and mocking Tom's romantic ideas than with his earlier focus on Huck's development and poking holes in the institution of slavery. Just as Jim is freed, so too is Huck with the knowledge that he has enough money to get away from society and do what he wants in the territory, which, note, as a region not yet transformed into states has fewer rules, including rules of slavery. He also learns that he is once and for all free of Pap's tyranny because Pap, through his own debauchery, has passed away. Huck ends his book where he began, with the prospect of being civilized. But being the restless and freedom-loving spirit he is, Huck refuses to do what he's already done, and so he decides to pursue freedom in a place he hasn't been yet, a place that is itself half-formed and semi-lawless, a place where a quick-witted boy can adapt to situations as needed and follow his own heart.